So let me introduce Dr. Sue Kay from QUT, from the ARC Centre of Excellence for Robotic Vision, in fact. Sue was recognised as one of 2018's Women in Robotics You Need to Know About, and one of Queensland's most influential people as a superstar of STEM. That's fantastic. Sue runs the world's first Robotic Vision Research Centre and has developed Australia's first Robotics Roadmap, highlighting how advances in robotics will impact on every sector of the Australian economy. With a PhD in geoscience, you're most welcome, she has interest in entrepreneurship and disruptive technologies, starting QUT's Social Robotics program. Sue's talk is titled Rocks and Robots. Without any further ado, please welcome Sue.
Thank you. First, before I start, who saw a robot on their way to digging deeper today? You did? Wow. So one lucky person in the audience, but nobody else was lucky enough to see a robot. And that's because despite robots being the physical manifestation of artificial intelligence and arguably one of the key technologies behind the fourth industrial revolution, we don't see a lot of them really. And I think the problem with that is that what we don't see, I think we can ignore. And I think Australia is at real risk of suffering quite a degree of complacency into how we're going to adapt to the industrial revolution that's coming. And what I'm going to cover in my talk today is a bit about where some of the robotics and computer vision technology is at the moment, how that might impact on the resources sector, how we sit compared to the rest of the world, and I guess where I hope that we might be able to be in the future. So Tony already gave a bit of an outline of me, so I guess the reason that I'm here is because I do have a background in geoscience, although it feels like it was a while ago now. And through a very circuitous path, I've ended up working with robots. So it is from rocks to robots, but there are some interesting connections between the two things. I guess to start with and to set the scene, you may not be aware, but by the end of this year, China will have purchased 1/3 of the world's industrial robots. China has a very ambitious robotics strategy for their nation. By 2020, they intend to be the world's #1 country for what we call robot population density. That's the number of robots per 10,000 workers. And they're doing this by investing $100 billion so that they can manufacture and be self-sufficient in the supply of their robots. So those are some pretty big numbers. On this slide, you can see that this is where Australia sits. And the unfortunate truth is, just as you haven't seen many robots on your way to digging deeper today, in general, Australia isn't really using robots. And we're certainly not applying automation at the same rate as a lot of our peer nations. So we have a robot population density of 83 robots per 10,000 people. And, you know, that's pretty good. That actually puts us above the world average. We rank number 18. But when you compare us with a country like Korea, which is currently the world #1, as I mentioned, China is set to try and take Korea's place. They determined that they will be the world's #1 country in this area. They have 631 robots per 10,000 employees. Now, there's a few reasons for that. Korea has a different economic structure to Australia, so they still have an automotive industry, and they also have a very strong industry in the manufacture of electrical components. Now, those two things lend themselves very much to the use of industrial robots. But even so, I'm surprised by the low uptake of robots in Australia, mainly because we are actually, despite people's best efforts to get rid of manufacturing in the country, we're actually still pretty good at it. It's still an important part of our GDP, and where we really have a strength is in niche manufacturing, which really lends itself to the application of robots. And why this is important, and this is regardless of whether you're in the resources sector or the manufacturing sector, why this is important to every single person in Australia is that what we do know is that over the last 5 years, our labour productivity has been pretty constant at 1.8% per year. And yet, for us to maintain our standard of living, And that's just to maintain it, not to improve it. Our productivity needs to be at 2.5%. Now, the way that you bridge that gap between labour productivity and general productivity, at least the most easy way to bridge that gap, is through the application of technology. And robotics and automation are key technologies in allowing us to bridge that gap and make sure that we can maintain our standards of living. And it's interesting that we're not gaining a lot of productivity improvement from the resources sector. So this is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. As you can see, mining's contributing 4%, or less than 4%, towards our national productivity. And we're not using robots, despite the fact that the productivity benefits of using robots are pretty well understood by most people. And these are just some figures by a few recent reports, a survey done by PricewaterhouseCoopers or PwC, and also a report some of you may have heard of called The Automation Advantage by economic consultancy group Alpha Beta. And there's some pretty large numbers in that report. They suggest that over the next to the year 2030, we can actually get $2.2 trillion worth of benefit if we can get robotics and automation right in Australia. And we also know that there are a range of other benefits that sometimes people don't really think about. But often when we're developing new robotic technologies, it's to solve specific problems, in particular to take people out of harm's way, so to make our workplaces safer. Now, some of the projections from the Alpha Beta report suggest that we will reduce workplace injuries by 11% if we're able to introduce robotics and automation into the workplaces. And, you know, another thing that people probably find a bit counterintuitive is that for many of our low-skilled workers, we can actually give them more interesting work, which is, again, a benefit that sometimes people don't think about when thinking about the adoption of robotics. And I guess the thing that's fantastic if you're a robotics researcher is that consumers are expectant. Now, what does that mean? It means that, in general, people have a really good attitude towards robots. They're quite optimistic about the introduction of robots in their lives, and in fact, they're even expectant that robots are going to be a part of everybody's life. And so we're in a period where there's a significant amount of goodwill towards the introduction of new robotic technologies. And what we know from, this is some material from PwC, what we know is that robots are gaining traction in some sectors. So in a sector like manufacturing, robots are nothing new. We've had robots in manufacturing for almost 70 years. The first robots on the car manufacturing plants were in the early 1960s. Transportation and logistics, also an area where robots are quite commonly used. But in other areas, you can see that the use of robots is only just gaining acceptance, or people are really experimenting with that. And in some cases, really, robots haven't infiltrated much at all. And I guess the other thing that we can observe is that when robots are introduced, industries are being transformed. And arguably, Australia is leading the world in the adoption of robotics and automation in the resources sector. And you're probably all familiar with a lot of the work that Rio Tinto has been doing. We are the first country in the world to have a fully autonomous mine. What some of you may not realise is that we also were the first country in the world to have an automated port. For those of you who flew into Brisbane, if you had a look down towards the river and port, you would have seen these automated straddle carriers. They transport containers around the port and know people in this area. Another important area for Australia is in asset inspection. Because we're a huge country with a low population density, we have thousands of kilometres of infrastructure in the form of roads, power lines, rail lines, bridges that all need to be inspected for everybody's safety, and it makes perfect sense for us to be using robots and or autonomous systems to be able to do that work. Probably less well known is the use of robots to help train a lot of our security and defence personnel. And as I mentioned, we've had robots in manufacturing for forever. One of the main challenges in manufacturing is actually appreciating the difference that a lot of the new robotic technologies can bring into their workplaces. But there are a lot of industries where we're really not seeing much uptake of robotics, and construction would be a good example of this. We do have a company called Fast Brick Robotics, established in Western Australia. They're listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, that has developed a bricklaying robot. But really, if you go to a construction site, you're unlikely to see any robots. Transport, I mean, you're likely to see a Tesla on the roads, but although we have the technology to be able to have self-driving cars, it will be some time before we have the regulatory environment where those cars can actually operate as they're intended, which is as robots. In healthcare, we do have some notable robots used in healthcare, and in fact, here in Brisbane, the Wesley Hospital is Australia's busiest robotic hospital. They have 2 of the robots pictured here, Da Vinci robots, which are suitable for abdominal surgery. But again, really, do you see a lot of robots when you visit a hospital? No, you don't. They really haven't had a big impact on the healthcare sector yet. In agriculture, I think Australia is really starting to lead the way in the development of robots for in what they call ag tech, and that makes perfect sense because we can't get enough people out into these remote areas to work the land. And in the environment, we're seeing some fantastic things, and I'll show you some examples of what the robots applied to environmental problems look like. But again, these are prototypes, so it's fantastic to give you an idea of what's possible, but in general, we're not really seeing these commonly used. And finally, in retail, Australia is, I guess, a little bit unusual compared to the rest of Asia in not really embracing the use, or not so much embracing, we haven't seen the introduction of robots in retail. And that's going to fundamentally change our relationship with robots, because robots can be used for a lot of things, but a lot of people don't appreciate that robots, unlike Data in Star Trek, who is always going to give you completely objective information, robots can actually be used to sell you stuff. And once people figure that out, perhaps their trust in that sort of technology will be undermined. And the fantastic news is that we have some great companies in this space in Australia, but you've probably never heard of them. So XMto, which is pictured up the top there with a large drone, is a company that does cinematography. They did all of the footage for the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. There's a range of examples there of Australian companies that are developing really cutting-edge robotic technologies. Now, in terms of the use of robots in resources, as I mentioned, I've probably been out of the resources sector for a little while, so you might even have more examples than this, but some of the obvious applications for robots include, in digging and dozing, in hauling things around, in breaking rocks, in mapping terrains, underwater digging, and also robotic drilling systems. Some of the potential uses of robots, I think, in situ mineral processing, it really has to be what we're aiming for. I know Mining 3 is doing some great work in this area. I think the use of robots to help facilitate in situ mining is going to be very important. And again, some other areas where robots might be able to be applied. What I'm going to show you is some examples of where I have to say our centre actually doesn't do a lot of work in the resources industry. We do some work with Caterpillar on underground navigation, but in general, a lot of the work that is being done in our centre is focused on other areas. Now, when we're talking about robots in mining, I guess, how many robots is that actually? So we know that in general, there are 2 different types of robots, or the way that robots are classified, they generally put into 2 different buckets. There are industrial robots, which you see pictured on the left, such as the KUKA robotic arm that you might see picking up things in a manufacturing facility. And then on the right, the typical robots that you'd find in the resources sector are what we call service robots. So they perform a particular service, and there's a huge range of different types of service robots. Your robotic vacuum cleaner at home is also called a service robot. And what you can see from these figures, which are from the International Federation of Robotics, is that there is a huge number of service robots being sold in comparison to industrial robots. It's the area that's probably expanding very rapidly at the moment. However, when you actually look at the number of robots, and it's hard to get these figures of exactly how many robots there are working in resources, but if you just have a look at the service robot category, the sales of those robots in the category where the robots used in the resources industry tend to be called field robots. Now, of those robots, 6,000 robots are sold each year in this field robot category, and of those, 5,300 of them are milking robots. So they're the robots that you put your cows in and they get the milk for you. So that doesn't leave a lot of other field robots around the world. So we're talking very small numbers of robots. But I think that in some ways that figure is quite deceptive, because despite the small numbers of robots being used on mine sites, they have a significant impact on the workforce. And I guess we see this in the fact that now, through workforce planning, Rio Tinto is planning for their new entry-level positions, rather than being truck driver, to be field technician, and working with the TAFE sector to make sure that we have people that have the right skills to be able to service this, albeit small, number of robots in the industry. They have a significant impact despite their low numbers. So where are all the robots? This footage is of one of the most modern car manufacturing facilities in the world. It's the Tesla car manufacturing plant in Fremont, California. And they have some amazing robots, and they give them inspirational names like Colossus and Wolverine. And they do, important things. They move things from A to B. They might be used for welding. But in general, if you were to have visited a car manufacturing plant that used robots in the 1950s and then went and saw this Tesla car manufacturing plant, there are some things that have not changed at all. And that's the fact that these robots are caged off from humans. No humans are allowed anywhere near those robots when they're operating. And that's because it's unsafe for people to be around those robots when they're operating. And there's a reason for that. I mean, it's depressing because in 60 years, in many respects, robots haven't evolved. But we've gotten to a point, really what we call a tipping point in robotic technology, where we now have the computer processing power to allow robots to use a lot of the very clever algorithms that have been being developed in computer vision and applying those to robotics. And the reason that that's important is because while you might see robots commonly used in manufacturing, where you can really very easily constrain the environment, so you can control where all of the materials and the people are at any point in time, in any location in those environments, the rest of the world doesn't work that way. So we call the rest of the world unstructured environments, and obviously earth science is a perfect example of this. So would you be using robots out in areas like this, out in the field, out helping you dig up fossils? Well, maybe in the future at some point you would, but at the moment I wouldn't be trusting a robot to be digging up our rare fossil finds. And that's because up to date we haven't had the technology that's capable of doing this. And so just to give you a little bit of an overview of what our centre does, our centre is trying to develop what we call robotic vision. It's the application of computer vision to robotics. And that's important because one of the reasons that you don't see robots in unstructured environments is because they don't see the world in the way that we do. By applying computer vision to robotics, we can help robots with that. We can give them that vision so that they can operate safely side by side with people. And so our centre is funded by the Australian Research Council. We are almost 5 years through our 7-year life, and we're a national research centre but have collaborations with international partners as well. And just to give you a bit of an example of some of the technologies that we have been developing, some of you may have heard of this robot. This is our crown of thorns starfish robot, and pictured on the left is a typical crown of thorns starfish. Unfortunately, my video for this is not working, but just to describe what is important about this robot and how vision can be such a game changer in terms of how you apply robots. Essentially, you're probably all familiar with the problem that we have with crown of thorns starfish. They're a native organism, but they eat coral. And That's fine when crown of thorns starfish are in low numbers, but since we've had agriculture along the east coast of Australia, we've had increased nutrient runoff into the waters of the Great Barrier Reef, and what that has meant is that unfortunately we have an increase in the numbers of crown of thorns starfish, so essentially they are eating more of the coral reef than is able to regenerate. And so crown of thorns starfish is responsible for 40% of the degradation of our Great Barrier Reef. The only way that you can control the numbers of crown of thorns starfish, because unfortunately we can't stop them breeding at the moment without making some significant changes to what we do along the east coast, is to inject them with a toxin. So James Cook University fortunately has developed a toxin, but the way that that toxin is applied is that we have to have human divers go down and manually inject each starfish. Now, unfortunately, people die scuba diving or snorkeling every year, so it's an inherently dangerous occupation. And the only place that it is economic for us to try and control the numbers of these crown of thorns starfish is in areas where tourists go. So the Australian Marine Park Tourism Authority pays for human divers to go down in areas where tourists go to inject these starfish to try and reduce their numbers. And the rest of the reef, which is the size of Italy, there's pretty much nothing we can do about it. So one of our roboticists, who's really an ecologist at heart, had the idea of trying to develop a prototype that could help to actually put a dent in the number of crown of thorns starfish. We felt if we could develop a robot prototype that can do this job, maybe we can actually have a significant impact. And so that's where the crown of thorns starfish robot was developed. And it is 100% vision guided. So it only has to operate in shallow water. It uses its vision, and it's only in the last few years that this has even been possible, because although I can't show you the picture of the robot, you can maybe get a bit of a sense of scale next to the research boat. The robot's less than 2 metres long, and it has to be able to do all of its onboard processing just within the robot itself. It's not tethered to anything. It has to be able to use its vision to find its way around, to create an onboard map, to actually locate and identify the starfish. And I can tell you, the Great Barrier Marine Park Authority really made sure that we were, if we were going to be injecting anything on the Great Barrier Reef, that it was going to be crown of thorns starfish and nothing else. We had to be able to show that we were more than 99% accurate at being able to identify the crown of thorns starfish. So it's doing all of that processing on board. It's also positioning the robot where it needs to be when when it has identified a crown of thorns starfish. It also has to be able to identify which starfish it's injected, because it wouldn't be very helpful if it just went around and injected the same starfish 200 times. This really is quite a remarkable achievement in many respects, because it is only in the last few years that we've had the processing power to be able to do this actually on board the robot. Because similar to when you're in underground mining, you are disconnected from GPS, and so you have to be able to navigate just using the tools that you have on board. Now, in some good news, one of the videos that I do have working, and this is work that's happening up on the Great Barrier Reef right now. It's very exciting. We've developed a new version of the crown of thorns starfish robot that we call RangerBot, which you'll see in some of this video footage coming up. But the reason that we're up at the Great Barrier Reef at the moment is because it's coral spawning season. So that's when the corals let out this larval, which can then be used to produce new coral. But the problem that we have is that because the seawater temperatures have increased, the corals, as they are spawning in areas which actually are no longer that great for that coral type. It needs to be several, maybe even 100 kilometres further south for that larval to have the best chance of survival. So what we're looking at doing is using these robots to help transport that larval material so that it is down further south in temperatures that are best suited for that coral type, so that we can really have a go at rejuvenating the coral reef. So it's a fantastic application of robots. A lot of people don't really think about how robots could be used to help save the environment. But this is one of those environments. And hopefully, although I can't show you a lot of examples of robot use in mining, what I'm hoping this will do is give you a bit of an idea of areas where it could be used. Rather than just using autonomous haulage vehicles, what could robots be used to do to help remediate mine sites and to help to rehabilitate them back into the condition that they were before mining first commenced? Now, this probably looks like something completely different, but you know, everybody has to have offices or warehouses where stuff gets moved around. And for those of you who haven't seen this before, this is footage of an Amazon warehouse. Or, sorry, I'll have to correct myself there. It's not, they don't call them warehouses in Amazon, they call them fulfillment centres. So this is an Amazon fulfillment centre, and as you can see, they have a whole range of these robots that look like large Roomba vacuum cleaner robots. And what those robots do is they go in underneath the shelves, they jack themselves up, and they can move those shelves anywhere they go. It's not a particularly sophisticated system. It's quite old now. In fact, Amazon is now one of the world's largest robotic companies by virtue of the fact that they purchased this company, Kiva Robotic Systems, for $750 million 8 years ago. Now, this Kiva robotic system, you can see the, actually you probably can't see in this particular footage, but on the floor there are actually QR codes. So the robots don't have to be particularly smart. They can just pick up where the codes are. The robots can sense where the other robots are. The robots know what is in each of those shelves. So you might also note that the shelves are completely randomly stacked because that's the most efficient mechanism. You don't just have a shelf of paper towel, a shelf of books. It doesn't matter where everything is because the robots know where everything is. So the only place where there is a human in this fulfillment centre, or there are two places where there are people in this fulfillment centre. One is where you actually stow material into those shelves, and the other is where you take material out of those shelves to put into a box to deliver your order, hopefully in time for Christmas. And the reason that they haven't used robots to do those tasks is because humans are still equipped with these absolutely amazing things at the end of our arms called hands. And there is absolutely nothing that comes close to the dexterity of a human hand in robotics. And I doubt there will be for at least 30 years. So robots have to find other ways of doing things. And one of the challenges that Amazon has set is, well, you know, what is required for a robot to be able to do that stowing and picking task? And I guess our centre got some claim to fame because we won what was called the Amazon Robotics Challenge last year. We were chosen from an international pool of competitors to even be in the competition. And then we went over to Japan, sent a team over to Japan and competed with the world's cheapest robot, well, not the world's, certainly the cheapest robot in the competition. We built it for about $10,000 in the lab just here at QUT. Some bits of metal you can see there. A lot of the components we 3D printed in-house. And we were allowed to design not only the robot, but also the shelving system. So we did an on-the-floor shelving system, and none of the teams, no team got into the final who didn't use an on-the-floor shelving system. You know, it's very bad for a human. We'd all get a bad back if we were trying to pick stuff up from the floor all day, but it's actually the best system for a robot. So you can see our robot there has, you can see a bit of a suction gripper that it used to pick things up. It had a wrist, so it could actually flip that over and use a 2-finger gripper if it needed to. The key to our success in winning this competition against teams that had, you know, robots that were literally worth hundreds of thousands of dollars was because of the application of computer vision. So we had our one of the things that Amazon did to make the challenge quite difficult was that although we could train our robot to identify a certain number of images that we were likely to expect in the competition, 45 minutes before each team competed, we were given 16 unseen items. So we had 45 minutes to train the robot up to be able to identify those items. Now, some teams were using what we call a pretty blunt approach to the problem, where they literally were taking thousands of images of each item, putting those up into the cloud and trying to crowdsource identification. So getting humans, getting all of you to do their work for them. So that's one approach that you can use. We took a more sophisticated approach, which we call, and developed what we call a few-shot learning algorithm. And what that meant was that we only had to take 7 images of each item and hand annotate them, and that was sufficient for the robot to reliably recognise each item. Now, why is that important? That's important because I guess the ultimate, you know, the holy grail in computer vision is to get to what we call zero-shot learning, where you don't even have to show the robot and train the robot up into what things look like, it can intuit what they might be based on the properties that it can see of that object in much more of a similar way to the way that humans figure these things out. So say, sorry Tony, I'll borrow your glass. Say you've never had the opportunity to train your robot to recognise a glass. When we get to the point where robots know sufficient information about the rest of the world, then we would hope that the robot would be able to intuit, well, based on the size of this, the fact that it looks like it might fit into a human hand, it has an open end, it has some sort of liquid in it, perhaps this is something humans use for drinking. Okay, so it's much similar, although despite what people say, robots are still nowhere near as clever as people. You can get robots to do tasks very, very well, so beat a human at Go. But where Lee Sedol made his big error, in my view, during that competition, was that he didn't just turn around and challenge the robot to a game of poker, or the artificial intelligence, because the artificial intelligence, the AlphaGo that won that competition, would never have been able to cope with that change. Okay, humans are really good at stringing different tasks together. We're jack of all trades, whereas robots still do not have that ability. Now, social robots, you're probably going, well, this is really going left field now. What does this have to do with resources? But as I said, resources isn't just about, digging stuff out of the ground. You have a whole infrastructure where you're transporting material around, where you have people in offices. How might social robots impact not just on your business, but on all businesses? So that's why we've developed a social robots program. This is one example of a social robot. You may or may not have seen before. The robot's name is Pepper. And social robots have no other purpose but to actually interact with people. Now, a lot of roboticists find that really frustrating, because if you were to ask a robot like Pepper to go and fetch you a cup of tea or to move something from A to B, it would be completely useless at that task. And that's because it's not designed to do that. It has these beautiful hands, you can probably see from those pictures, very expressive. But that's actually all that they're designed to do. They're designed for the robot to be able to express itself. And in fact, the robot's hands actually just move like this. So it has very limited capacity to even pick anything up. But again, that's not the point. What you can get a social robot to do, though, is to go and get your tea-making robot to go and make a cup of tea. Okay? So your tea-making robot might not be particularly, socially adept. So you can just choose to talk with your much more friendly social robot and ask it to get the other robots to do stuff. But the reason that social robots are important is because I don't know that we've really looked at a lot of the unexpected impacts that some of these technologies are going to have. So, yeah, social robots might not seem particularly useful, but they can serve functions, and in fact, if you've travelled in Asia, you might have seen these already, where they act as concierges in either hotels or in shops. They can be programmed to understand thousands of languages. So if you're travelling in a foreign country and you can't find someone who speaks your language, you could be helped out by one of these robots. Concierge robot serves a useful function in just answering questions. Sometimes that can take a lot of pressure off human staff. One of the areas that we have been trialling these robots is up at Townsville Hospital recently. And it's been with a very simple, what we call concierge function, because you wouldn't believe the amount of time our healthcare professionals spend answering questions like, where do I get a coffee? Where do I pay for parking? Unfortunately, also, where do I get a smoke? Now, for people who work within Queensland Health, you can't just say, just whip out the back, you can have a smoke out there. You actually have to then give the people, recommendations and the number for quitline, and suggest that perhaps while they're in hospital, they could try nicotine patches. And you can imagine if you've done that 20 times a day, that, you're probably not looking forward to the next person who comes and asks where they can get a smoke. So there are a lot of useful functions that these robots can use. We feel that they can be used to serve even more functions if we also give them the power to use computer vision. So what we would like to see is these robots being used to help people stay at home longer. So once you can have these robots in your home, you trust them as your companions, you can ask them questions just like you ask your Google Home or your Amazon Alexa, but these move around, they can see, they can check on you. I mean, some people might find that creepy, but for a lot of people who have to move out of their homes because they're at danger of having a fall or perhaps, going into a diabetic coma, then a robot like this you can see could have a lot of uses. It can just be going around the home checking, is the person okay? But for that, we need to be able to solve a lot of those computer vision challenges, to be able to recognise when is a person lying down asleep versus when is a person lying down on the ground and has had a fall. So some action needs to be taken. But I think that's where we could be in the very near future. And some of the statistics there, I think again this is from PwC, suggests that really the use of robotics in a lot of what we call front of house functions is going to be a reality. And I think that's an area of robotics that a lot of people don't give a lot of thought to. So we've put together, as Tony previewed, a robotics roadmap for Australia, just to give an outline of where Australia is currently at. We have a section on resources in there. But why this was important was because, unfortunately, until we did this roadmap, there was very little known about the robotics industry in Australia. How many companies, can anyone tell me, how many companies are there in Australia who do robotics? Are there any? Well, this was a question that clearly troubled us because we're supposed to be a centre specialising in this, and obviously the local robotics industry is one of our most important stakeholders, and yet we were having trouble really identifying who was part of this space. So we did this partly as an exercise to try and unearth what was going on in the sector. And the reason that that's important, and we've really taken a leaf out of the resources sector here, is because of the lessons learned from the METS sector. Now, for those of you who don't know the story, METS was not a sector only a few years ago. It's fairly new terminology. So people who are now in the METS sector were traditionally, and especially in terms of Australian Bureau of Statistics, kind of probably mainly put in the manufacturing space. Maybe some of them would go in resources, maybe some of them would go in services. So they were kind of scattered everywhere. Now, why that is an issue is that it means that, one, we don't know how many companies there are in the space, but two, it makes it really hard for them to get venture capital. So my understanding is that once the METS sector actually was defined, people knew what it was. People for the first time recognised what a huge contribution it was making to the Australian economy in terms of exports. It was only at that time, and I think Gecko was the example of this, that a lot of those companies were able to access venture capital. And that's important because we're not going to have homegrown industries unless we can get access to capital. And understandably, people don't want to give capital away unless they understand an industry. So this is why we thought this robotics roadmap was important. And what we found was that we believe that there are more than 1,000 companies, robotics companies, operating in Australia today, and that very conservatively we think they employ more than 50,000 people and that they're worth more than $12 billion to the Australian economy. Numbers that, until recently, were unknown. And unfortunately, numbers that will continue to be hard to get because the Australian Bureau of Statistics collects information on a sector basis, and robotics is not really considered its own sector, and understandably so, because you can apply robotics across all sectors of the Australian economy. The kind of bubble diagram is just giving you a bit of an idea of the level of activity in robotics in different areas in Australia. It pretty much correlates with population, so no real surprises there. But one thing that came out when we were doing a lot of our consultation sessions around the robotics roadmap was the frustration that many people were feeling that we were not sharing information across our industry sectors. I mean, it can be very useful sometimes to all, obviously here, we're all part of the resources sector, but sometimes that can hold us back. And a lot of people ask the questions, in particular, this is interesting, a lot of people in manufacturing wanted to know, resources, they seem to be doing great stuff in automation. How can we get some of that? What can we learn from your experiences? I think we need to find better ways to get diffusion of this information across because otherwise it's kind of bad for the economy overall. And I think importantly, if you take anything away from today, I think it's very important that we all embrace our inner geek. I think when we're worried about skill shortages and young people coming into industries like the mining industry, what we forget is that labels like mining, like resources, like manufacturing, for a lot of people, they're not the sort of industries that unfortunately parents aspire for their children to enter. If you were law, if you were medicine, you probably have or accounting even, you probably have a lot easier time convincing parents that their children should be going into those industries. But what we never say enough is that really mining is an important part of the tech sector. Now, we don't seemingly have much of a defined tech sector in Australia, and yet when you have a look at some of the world-class work that's being done in Australia, particularly in robotics and automation, really, why are a lot of mining companies not calling themselves tech companies? And that's probably going to spark a whole day's worth of debate, but I think that's important in how people view these industries, because where we're doing most of our important high-tech work are in industries that people look at as old-fashioned, in mining, in manufacturing. And yet the opportunities, if you're interested in tech, if you're a young person interested in tech, it's not at Google and at Apple. Certainly not if you want to stay in Australia. They're in the big mining companies, even small mining companies, companies like Robotics, manufacturing companies. We need to be changing the way that we speak about this so that we can encourage people to be in this. And hopefully it goes without saying that we need a more diverse workforce. So robotics, we have less than 10% women. You know, if we really want to change the numbers in terms of our skills shortages, we have to find ways to have more women involved. And I guess finally, robots equal new jobs. Again, this might seem counterintuitive, but despite a lot of the headlines, all of the economic data that we have is that robots actually can help create jobs. So yes, there will be some jobs that change. There may be some jobs that disappear, but the overall numbers of jobs significantly increase. So I showed you that number for world robot population density, and what that number also probably doesn't show, though, is that the countries with the highest robot population density also have the best figures for their GDP. Okay, what that means is the wealthier that you are, the more that you can have people in employment. So robots do equal new jobs. And why are robots important to resources? Well, I think just as I mentioned that a lot of manufacturing companies indicated to us that they want to learn from the resources sector, I think that it's always valuable to learn, the resources sector can learn from other sectors. And I think it's always true that operations can be made more structured, which makes them more suitable for immediate application of robotics and automation. I think we all have to be prepared that automation is going to gain traction across all areas, and we really need to be preparing our workforce for the changes that are going to be happening as part of the fourth industrial revolution. It really is an imperative, because for us to get the best benefits of the adoption of robotics and automation, we need to do it quickly. The worst thing we can do is nothing. If you can catch up with me at morning tea, I have some summaries. We've actually just commissioned a report called the Robotics and Automation Advantage for Queensland. So this is specifically looking at what the Queensland economy has to gain from robotics and automation. Also have some short summaries of the Robotics Roadmap. But it's important because, and another point I wanted to make is resources has a huge opportunity with the development of the new space agency. The philosophy of the space agency is, because Australia is coming into the race fairly late, we're not going to be like other countries like Canada, where, you know, they can develop things for the space industry and then, you know, maybe 10 years later, hopefully, you know, someone down on Earth is able to use that technology. We need to flip that model. We need to be making things that can be commercially successful here on Earth, which we can also use in space. And what industry is the one that's probably most like space in terms of having to have things that can operate in remote areas, you know, with you know, no interaction with people? That's resources. So there's important links there. And yes, just to give you an idea of the scale of the importance of this, Canada many years ago developed what they call the Canadarm, which is a robotic arm that they use on the International Space Station so that they can load and unload material. It really was something that glued the whole Canadian space community together, and also really saw what we are now seeing as a golden age of robotics and AI in Canada. And on the Canada $5 bill, you can see they very proudly have a picture of their Canadarm. Wouldn't it be fantastic to live in a country where a technology can actually make it onto one of your bank bills? That's the sort of country that I'd like Australia to be. And I'd probably finally just like to mention, I guess, a bit of a caution in as much as technology can really take us by surprise in how quickly these things can evolve. So some of you may not know the history of self-driving cars, but it was only just over 10 years ago that we really had the first self-driving car. It was part of a DARPA Grand Challenge, and that's the winning vehicle there on the left. And as you can see, it's completely bristling with sensors on the outside, on the inside completely full of CPUs. It was lucky that it had to be self-driving because you weren't going to fit a person in there. And yet now, 10 years later, on our roads, it's not legal to let them drive themselves, but a Tesla is essentially a self-driving car. You wouldn't trust it 100% yet, but it is essentially a self-driving car. That is how technology can change in 10 years. And finally, to end on a positive note, we have a lot to be proud of in terms of robotics in Australia. As I've mentioned, we're the first country in the world to automate a mine site, first country in the world to automate one of our ports. There's an Australian group down in Canberra who were instrumental in developing a thing called ArduPilot, which is an open source autopilot system. It's actually installed in almost every drone that you're ever likely to buy. So DJI, the main manufacturer of drones, uses ArduPilot. As I showed you in our videos, we've got some of our scientists developing robots that, hopefully can help rejuvenate the Great Barrier Reef. There are a lot of fantastic success stories here, but we want to make sure that our talent and our technology stay here in Australia and that they're not just absorbed by self-driving car companies over in the States. And to do that, we need to find ways that we can support the local industry. And I think resources is actually going to be critical to that. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview. As I said, robotics, we've got a lot of fantastic stuff happening here in Australia, but it's fragmented. We just have to pull those fragments together. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sue. That was a really interesting insight into the future. And that's part of what today is about, is exposing ourselves to new ideas, new thinking. I'll pass on a small gift to Sue. Thank you very much on behalf of the GSQ. Let me just perhaps close before morning tea with a request to Sue, actually. I looked at the social robot and I like that. I want a business version that can do crappy jobs that I have to do, like the monthly report. So if we can do one of those, that'd be great. But I guess more realistically, an anecdote that's live in the GSQ now, unfortunately, is we had planned to do a big airborne survey in the northwest. And we contracted the data acquisition company to fly it. And we found that, I guess it slipped through the cracks that the aircraft that we'd hired, wasn't cooled, wasn't air conditioned. And we wanted to run this over from now through summer. Anyway, the solution put forward by the contractor was that the pilot would wear an ice vest. So he'd be cool, or she would be cool while flying the plane. And we can't accept that kind of approach, unfortunately. But the sort of thing crying out for the use of drone technology. Take away the pilot. Which brings me to my second anecdote, I suppose, is that for many years I was a drilling manager for a company, and we had at one point 17 drilling rigs. And when you're the drilling manager, you'll invariably get a call at 2 a.m. And you know at 2 a.m. the news is not good. It's generally either an injury to a person or a downhole problem, which talks to dollars. Every minute there's dollars ticking over. So, and what would generally happen when we did our investigation and found what had gone on, it was human error. So drilling, data acquisition for geophysics, they're things that very clearly this technology could be applied to. So I think there's a rich future for us in the exploration world with this sort of technology. I mean, it's really pleasing to hear where we're at and where Australia's at and the work that Sue and her team are doing.